How Reagan ruined everything.
And make America great again.
Make America great
Didn't I
again.
watch this?
Make America great again.
And we will make America great again.
What is this? Why Ronald Reagan was the
can burn
devil?
in the flames of tar. Modern Republicans left who aren't blithering idiots look for conservative tones that would.
Let's do
Republicans.
Let's do Leeja Miller's video. Also, I have a lot of fun stuff on the docket. Don't you worry. We're gonna watch the Mr. Beast video as well.
Ronald Reagan for president. Let's make America great again.
Ronald Reagan is considered by some to be the greatest president in the history of the United States.
She has a newer one. She has a newer Reagan video. Damn, 1.5 million views. Yo, videos bang. She does a great job. I really enjoy her videos. Leeja Miller, my goat. The one on Cop Cities. No. If Reagan has 0 haters, I am dead. Wait, why do you hate Cody Shoddy again? Wait, what? I just said I love Cody Shoddy. I just don't want to watch an entire hour. What are you talking? I've had him on the stream. He like, people are so funny, dude.
I've always understood that to mean that people loved his version of supply-side economics, also known as trickle-down economics. Tax the rich less, and the benefits would trickle down to all of society. That's just basic economics. Well, turns out, no it's not, and also Reagan's trickle-down theory is just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to the many theories and agendas that Reagan pushed during his administration. Ronald Reagan was elected president in 1980. The 8 years that followed ushered in not only the largest redistribution of wealth in a generation, but also the termination of welfare benefits for thousands of Americans, a dramatic rollback of unions and labor organizing, and an infiltration of Christian fundamentalism into American government, the consequences of which we are still very much feeling to this day. Ronald Reagan walked so that Donald Trump could run, and he altered the American way of life for everyone but the top 1%. 40 years after first being elected president, the myth of Ronald Reagan still lives on in the minds of people who are too deluded to see that the American dream Reagan stood for is the same American dream he irreversibly decimated during his time as president.
Someone asked this, was Reagan like Thatcher for the US? Yes, Reagan and Thatcher are identical in policy, and absolutely 100%, like their impact is nearly identical.
This is how Reagan ruined everything.
I gotta pee real quick.
Before I get into all the ways that Reagan royally screwed us over, I want to take a minute to thank my partner on today's video, Hungry Root. Hungry Root is an online grocery service that makes it super easy to eat healthy, personalized meals. All you gotta do is tell them a little bit about yourself through a short, fun little quiz, including any dietary restrictions, any goals you have, like eating healthier or reducing food waste, plus your favorite flavors and foods, and then Hungry Root will send you fresh groceries and simple recipes right to your door every week. And you all already know how much I hate cooking and grocery shopping, so Hungry Root makes my life so much easier. Hungry Root is different because the recipes they send are seriously so simple. I'm talking like 10 minutes tops. Love this for me! And it is the most easily customizable grocery or meal service I've ever tried. Can't eat gluten? They gotcha. Vegetarian? Totally cool. No dairy? No problem. You get the picture. You can edit your weekly deliveries and choose exactly what you want to receive, or you can let Hungry Root choose for you. I always let Hungry Root choose for me because, listen, I run my own business, I'm making choices all day long. It is such a relief to just be able to say, hey, Hungry Root, here's what I like, here's what I don't like. Please just send me food. And once you get your
Ethical reacts, baby. That was a tactical piss. I knew that the ad break was gonna happen. That's why I went
groceries, you can just mix and match what they've sent you, or you can follow the easy recipes they send. And the more you use Hungry Root, the better it gets at its personal recommendations for you, which I love. I've been getting Hungry Root for a while now, and it's so nice to get exactly what I want because Hungry Root knows me, you know? And it seriously has saved me so much time in grocery shopping and meal prep. Plus, you never get bored because there are over 2,000 recipes to discover and a wide variety of options for all diets. Plus, they send snacks and breakfast options too, so you get all people to the link down below. Thanks, Hungry Root. To say that our current levels of economic inequality and political instability are the result of a single man is hyperbolic at best, and frankly gives Reagan more credit than he deserves. Our system was enough to produce and support a man like Reagan as president. He didn't just appear out of thin air. But it is hard to pinpoint another president that has had such enduring and wide-ranging negative impacts on the American way of life. I'm going to unpack Reagan's impact by focusing on who and what he hurt, namely the middle class, minorities, and democracy. Starting with the middle class, let's talk about what Reagan is most known for: Reaganomics, a theory of supply-side economics that says that by removing regulations on businesses and lowering their taxes, they would be able to be more productive, have more freedom to be agile in the market, and that growth would then translate to more jobs and higher wages for workers. The wealth would start at the top and it would trickle down to everyone. When Reagan took office, the US was going through what was called stagflation, where both inflation and unemployment rates were high. The country was in the worst recession since the Great Depression at the time. Because of this, people were primed for major economic change, and Reagan ushered in that change. After the Great Depression, the New Deal came with huge amounts of government spending on everything from mortgage financing for whites only, more on that in my last video on housing segregation, to job creation, to building infrastructure, and these government programs were popular because they did grow the economy and create jobs and build a large, thriving middle class in America. Minimum wages stayed consistent with productivity. The more productive the average worker was, the
I think saying Reagan ruined everything is lazy liberal analysis. Sure, he kicked off neoliberalism in the U.S., but this was an inevitability with the erosion of the wider global socialist movements around the world. Western capital no longer needed to placate to the working class to stave off socialism domestically. Yes, you're right. You're absolutely right. But I'm still going to do the reductive propaganda here because I'm a propagandist. She also did mention that, like, obviously there's no singular force, there's no singular evil, there's no singular man responsible. You're doing the thing that chatters do to me all the time, which is like reframe what I just said back to me, but contentious, as though I didn't just say exactly the point that you're making. She didn't go that far in, but still, I agree with you.
more the minimum wage increased. That connection was broken, however, as the US tax code began moving away from the New Deal. Reagan wasn't the sole president responsible for creating tax cuts for the wealthiest Americans, but he sure did it with the most gusto and to the largest degree. Before Reagan's presidency, income tax on the wealthiest Americans, that's the money that they had to pay to the government as a proportion of how much they made each year, was at 70%. So above a certain threshold, the wealthiest Americans had to pay,
which, by the way, wasn't even the highest. Highest was 90. Okay. Yeah. Remember that.
70% of their income to the government. By the end of Reagan's presidency, that number dropped to 28%. He also
For those of you who do not understand, let me just describe to you. This does not mean that, like, oh, if you're the highest earner, then the government takes 90% of all of your wealth. Okay. That's not how this works. If you're in that tax bracket, every dollar post that tax bracket is taxed at 70%. That's just how it works. It's just, I know that a lot of people don't understand this and they go, what do you mean? So that means if I make like whatever the top marginal tax rate was at that point, or whatever like the margin was at that point, means that like you're making less than the person in a lower bracket than you. That's not how that works. That would be ridiculous. Okay, FDR wanted to go even higher, I think, to 99, which was the equivalent of 300K now, I think.
also created major tax breaks for corporations and estates, all in the name of creating smaller government and putting more money in the hands of the wealthiest people.
Hasan advocating for higher taxes, but why doesn't he pay higher taxes then? Big brain emoji. You're right. Yes. When I advocate for a higher taxes for top earners, I am directly advocating against my, in the American sense, self-interest. Why? Because it's short-term benefits that I'm casting aside in terms of having more money left in my pocket for much better returns overall in the long term. Okay? Hasan famously pays the most taxes. I mean, I do. I literally do. But having said that, ironically, I do pay more taxes than I'm supposed to, and then the IRS sends me a back almost every year. So, you know, you can't really do that in this country. It's another thing that people always like just, Anyway, ultimately, I am paying like more than EU taxes, especially living in California. Okay? Because I don't have assets. I don't have stocks. I don't get paid in the form of stocks. I don't have a tax shelter. I don't have offshore accounts. I don't have a way to hide my earnings. What you see is what I get, and what you see is what I pay. Okay? Many people at my level of income will usually open up a bunch of different ways of engaging in perfectly legal tax avoidance measures. I don't do that. One, because I'm too lazy. Two, obviously, it's, you know, not the most ethical thing to do, in my opinion. Having said that, however, I do have a IRA. I do have that. That doesn't mean that I don't have a way to do it. Of course, I have a mechanism to do it. I just don't. I max out to my IRA, and that's it. Now listen. You don't write off any of your trips. No, of course I write off things that I am able to write off. What do you mean? There's a difference between opening up new ways of like putting your direct income versus just being a dumbass. Like, what are you talking about? Write-offs are not tax evasion, and it's also not free money. It just lowers your tax burden. People don't understand this. People literally have this like dude, Americans love talking about taxes and legitimately don't understand how taxes work at all. They think marginal tax rates mean, oh, they just take all of your money. Okay? Wrong. They think marginal tax rates are a flat tax. That's not how that works. That's number one. Number two, they think that write-offs automatically give you money in your pocket. No, dude, you spent that money already. You're just telling the government, this is where I spent the money. Like, this money is not directly just sitting in my pocket, burning a hole. I spent it. So that they're like, okay, we'll lower your tax burden. The average American's taxes are much simpler than yours. They have no idea how it works. Not necessarily. Mine is absolutely. There's a difference between tax deduction and tax credits than credits that are non-refundable. My taxes are my taxes are not complex because of the things that I just mentioned, because I don't have these like different avenues that are readily available, but I don't use them. So it's like pretty simple. It's just, you know, I literally make the money that, you know, I make, subscriptions, revenue, and then I just pay it at the end of the year. We have a regressive tax structure. Is about percentages of income that impacted. It used to be different. Yes. Ultimately, the effective tax rate for the wealthiest Americans used to be much higher at the end of the year. Okay. Nowadays, it's unimaginably low for a bunch of different reasons. It's not necessarily just about the top marginal tax rate being lowered so much. That definitely plays a pretty big role, though. But the other major contributor to this is also the way people get paid. Okay? The way people get paid in this country. The highest earners in this country do not get paid on flat income. Okay? They just don't specifically get paid on income. Most of the times, a lot of that money is just parked in the stock market. Depending on what level of 1%er you are, you also used to be able to quite literally just take money against the net worth that you have for basically free and you know, just spend debt rather than touch your assets. I'm a tax accountant. There are many loopholes, but you need to have a high enough income that it would make sense to do it. Most average Americans will not be able to exceed the standard deduction no matter what they do. Yeah. Isn't that what most billionaires do? Yes. By used to, you mean when interest rates were lower, right? Yes.
And companies in the country. Some of the effects of his economic policies in the short term were positive. The period of stagflation became...
Should asset value be taxed? Absolutely. We have a mechanism for, to do this for property. We have literally the method right there. We absolutely should be doing that. Yes, 100%.
Became less pronounced. Inflation and unemployment both decreased, but those numbers belie the fact that the connection between wealth and productivity was severed, and the rich got richer while the poor and middle class saw very little economic progress during this time. The incomes of the lowest 90% rose by 17%, while those of the top 10% rose by 106%. Talk about a trickle. In the years since Reagan's presidency, that gap between rich and poor has continued to widen. Today, the top 10% of income earners in the US hold 72% of the total wealth. And the bottom half of income earners, the 50% of the American population, holds 2% of the wealth. Between 1978 and 2021, average worker compensation increased 18.1%. The top CEO compensation increased 1,460% in that same time period. In 1980, the average
Excuse me. Those guys are the most productive workers, okay? Hello? Excuse me. The guy whose sole responsibility is to keep wages down for every worker underneath them with a fiduciary responsibility to increase shareholder value. And how do you increase shareholder value? Outsourcing, layoffs, elimination of redundancy, cutting corners on safety and maybe even quality of the product that you're making. And of course, in the United States of America post-Reagan, ironically, stock buybacks, refusing to actually do anything that is remotely innovative unless it's a new financial tool that you're applying, because every company is basically turned into a bank. The financialization of the American economy is what will bring about the downfall of capitalism.
CEO earned 36 times more money than the average worker, and today the average CEO earns 400 times more. The wealthiest have never been wealthier, while for the average worker, wages haven't even kept up with inflation. This shit ain't trickling, Ronnie. What now? And it's not like at the time Reagan implemented trickle-down economics in the early 80s that it was this brand new, newfangled invention that everyone was optimistic about. A lot of people were like, hey, this is really gonna hurt poor people. But Ronnie was...
No, Ronald Reagan's yes. Ronald Reagan's greatest move was that he was able to communicate to the working poor that they were better off with this kind of neoliberalism than without. And he applied, and this is going to be kind of reductive, he applied a very simple method. It's called blame black people. Okay? Which is, listen, we got to do everything we can to cut social safety nets, okay? Because black people are taking advantage of it. They're also violent thugs who are eating crack cocaine on a regular basis. Americans love that, okay? White Americans loved that shit. Specifically, white Americans on welfare loved that shit. They were like, yeah, that's a good idea. We should definitely do away with the social safety nets. We should definitely do away with the rich actually, paying their fair share, because one day I too will be rich.
Convinced by his neoliberal economic pals that keeping the wealthiest people happy will mean prosperity for all, because Ronald Reagan was convinced that the American dream was alive and well, and the common theme through all of his policy choices was that individuals are the creators of their own destiny, that anyone could pick themselves up by their bootstraps if they really wanted to, and that any struggling was simply a moral failure on the part of the individual, and not a failing on the part of the system that stood on their necks. And it was through Reagan that this idea that the government is your enemy and stands in the way of your freedom and prosperity really took hold in the Republican consciousness writ large, to the point that working and middle-class people voted to re-elect him, even though it was actively against their own best interest to do so. Sound familiar? This was clear in his
Yeah, Americans are very stupid and have been for quite some time.
Trickle-down economic policy, but it was also clear in his stance on labor rights. The 20th century saw a peak in labor unions, especially in the 40s and 50s, when over 1/3 of all workers in the US were members of a union. Unions were strong and could mount strong challenges against employers, and they brought about important labor laws like the 8-hour workday, minimum wage, child labor laws, and civil rights laws in the 1960s. During this...
It's pretty cool that we've basically destroyed all of that, by the way. We're now living in a universe where obviously 1099s is the method. Contracted work has done away with almost all of that in general. I'm talking about specifically the 8-hour workday. We have governors all around the country signing into law, labor deregulation that makes it so that children can actually work. Yeah, the gig economy, the gigification of the economy. It's great. Whew.
Period, Ronald Reagan himself was the president of the Screen Actors Guild, a labor union for actors. At some point in the 50s, Ronald flipped from Democrat to Republican. He claimed it was because his party, the Democrats, failed him. It could also be that while he was president of the Screen Actors Guild, he granted a rare waiver to MCA, his own talent agency, to allow them to start producing television shows. They needed a waiver because it was a real conflict of interest when the people who manage talent become the people who also hire the talent. You see, after that waiver was granted, Reagan conveniently was given a cushy TV job through MCA that paid him $125,000 per year in 1950s money, and he became a walking spokesman for GE, an influencer before there were influencers. The FBI eventually investigated MCA and the waiver granted to them by the Screen Actors Guild, including Reagan, for anti-competitive behavior. Nothing came of the probe for Reagan, though MCA was forced to break up. It was around this time that Reagan conveniently was like, you know what? Unions. The government. Too many regulations. I'm a Republican now. Interesting. But he, of course, used his history as a union president to his advantage while running for governor of California and later for United States president, pointing out that he was the only candidate who's actually been president of a labor union in order to win over the working class white vote. Convenient.
Where free unions and collective bargaining are forbidden, freedom is lost.
And a lot of them voted for him, which was against their self-interest.
Donald Trump's populism. I don't think he studied Ronald Reagan that extensively. I think he just basically, as a television guy, was a really good room reader. And Donald Trump's Trump is seen as Trump is seen as pro worker, even though he went to that scab rally. Exactly. Donald Trump routinely does this as well. He is poison for the labor unions. Okay. And yet, there are a shit ton of card-carrying rank and filers out there. And I know many of you are in unions yourselves, and you know exactly who the I'm talking about, that absolutely love Donald Trump.
And that was made abundantly clear not long into his presidency when in 1981, PATCO, the Air Traffic Controllers Union, went on strike to demand better working conditions and increased pay. See, the problem with this is that the workers were technically federal employees, and it was against the law for federal employees to strike. Roughly half of all U.S. flights were grounded during the strike. And Reagan held
Trump is seen as everything because he owns the libs. That's all that matters to them, even at their own demise. His politics is spite. Yeah, the reason why the American political equation is just about owning your political opponents is because of neoliberalism in general and how it took over both of the parties, especially post Ronald Reagan. Because Ronald Reagan is bad. Bill Clinton also drove the final nail into the coffin. Okay, you have to understand. You have to understand. This didn't happen over. This didn't happen overnight. It wasn't one person. It was both parties genuinely responsible for this. And the reality is, this is why we say there are two, neoliberal right-wing parties in this country. And when both parties are basically aligned on these issues, either through the Democratic capitulation, which is what they claim is the reason why they have to do this, because there's too much interest from the public to do certain things that are incredibly right-wing, or directly because they are agitating and demanding this because their donors are demanding it, like the Republican Party is doing. Ultimately, at the end of the day, there is no momentum for workers. There is no real material change that people feel they can vote for, that people will ever realize in their lives. Okay, Ramazan. Carter has some blame in introducing neoliberalism in the Democratic Party. See airline deregulation, for example. No, absolutely. Truckers too, if I'm not mistaken.
Held a press conference on the matter and made his stance very clear.
And if they do not report for work within 48 hours, they have forfeited their jobs and will be terminated.
And then, 2 days later, 12,000 federal air traffic controllers lost their jobs and were barred from ever working for the federal government again. It was a show of strength that debilitated the organized labor movement, and it hasn't recovered since. Where at its peak, union membership accounted for over a third of all workers in the United States, by the end of Reagan's presidency, that number was cut in half. Today, union membership accounts for roughly 10% of all workers, which is a historic low. The reason for this dramatic decrease in union members is twofold. One, Reagan's firing of the air traffic controller sent a strong message to the private sector that union busting is fair game. And two, Reagan appointed his own cronies to head the National Labor Relations Board, the federal board that oversees unions. And they worked to loosen regulations on businesses and let them get away with like nearly whatever they wanted. And the suppression of the labor movement is shown in the numbers, not only in the dwindling number of union members, but also in the dramatic decrease in strikes, a common tool used by unions to counteract the power imbalance between workers and corporations. Prior to 1979, there were on average between 200 and 400 large-scale labor strikes on any given year. There were 187 in 1980. By 1989, there were 40. And in 2017, there were 7. Even the recent stirrings we've seen to unionize Amazon facilities, Starbucks coffee shops, and recently the first unionized strip club pales in comparison to the power of the labor unions in the middle of the 20th century that helped shift the balance of power away from the large corporations, who had all the money and all the bargaining chips, into the hands of workers. For example, my experience, having worked numerous jobs in
This, I think, is both in Europe and even in the United States of America to a lesser degree, is a direct consequence. Like unions having this much power, prominence, and being able to operate was, well, one, because the assembly line was so perfect for unionization, where people could, people could definitely genuinely recognize class solidarity. In comparison to like the white collar stuff, but in comparison to the white collar work that is readily available, in comparison to even like retail, that's like gig economy work in general. But beyond that, it was the USSR. The existence of a counterbalance, the existence of a counterweight to American capitalism created a pressure point for American capitalists. It created a reason for them to capitulate to these demands, because trade unionism was far more preferable to communism, right? This is something that a lot of Americans refuse to comprehend, by the way. And I mean like Americans who fancy themselves to be progressives, Americans who don't want to recognize that having this kind of counterweight is good. It's a good thing. It's a great thing, because without it, in the absence of that, look at where we're at. It's also one of the reasons why I don't like talk too much shit about people who are, legitimately to the left of me. What's up? Down? Good girl. Because they play the role of normalizing and making me look more moderate in comparison, and that's not necessarily a bad thing.
In the 21st century, is that companies treat you like they're doing you a favor by giving you a job. Like, you should be so lucky. And like, you have to show loyalty to the company above all else, otherwise you're a bad worker. They pay you what they want, they fire you whenever they want, and they do not have to give one flying fart about you because you are replaceable to them. They hold all the power. You want a job, take it or leave it. Most of them don't even list the pay range on their job postings unless they're legally required to. And if you were to ask for the pay range up front before putting in the effort to apply for the job, well, you might as well just not apply for the job, because no hiring manager is going to look favorably on that. You're supposed to want the job because you're passionate about widgets and working for that company. Doing a job for money is not the team player attitude that we're looking for. Not to mention the fact that HR exists to keep the company from getting sued, not to protect your interests. So you can see how unions are so powerful, because it's only through collective bargaining and organizing that workers can balance out the power with their employers. Okay, sorry, I needed to go down that labor organizing tangent, but it really can't be overstated the devastating impact of the Reagan administration on workers' rights and workers' income. This combination, the huge tax cuts for the wealthy and the busting of unions, absolutely decimated the middle class and concentrated the power and money in the hands of big business and the top 10%. But it wasn't just the middle class he was coming after. Before taking office, Reagan ran for president in 1976 and lost the Republican nomination to incumbent Gerald Ford. During that first presidential run, Reagan was touting the failures of big government and discussing what he claimed was rampant abuse of the country's welfare system. And he kept coming back to this same story.
In Chicago, they found a woman who holds the record. She used 80 names, 30 addresses, 15 telephone numbers to collect food stamps, Social Security, veterans benefits for 4 non-existent deceased veterans' husbands, as well as welfare. Her tax-free cash income alone has been running $150,000 a year.
The welfare queen.
Sound familiar? Not just specifically on the issue of welfare, okay? Not just specifically on the issue of welfare, but just in general. That is at the heart of getting one guy is at the heart of Republican politics, okay? They love one guying the situation. So successful as a method.
You know her, you love her. She's a scam artist. She's having babies just to make more money from the government. She's a liar. She's a cheat. She's sucking the system dry. She's black and she's everywhere. Boo. In reality, this story Reagan kept telling out of Chicago was about a woman named Linda Taylor. Her crimes were many. She was a scam artist. She was tried and convicted of welfare fraud, but the total they could prove she ever defrauded the government for was $8,000. Not $150,000 per year. Nor was she an accurate example of welfare recipients, because most welfare recipients were and are white people, an uncomfortable truth that detractors don't want to face. Nor is there any shame in benefiting from that system. I've benefited from food stamps, unemployment, and veterans benefits numerous times throughout.
My favorite thing is being a West Virginian on disability, okay, and just being the most right-wing guy you've ever seen, consistently talking about how black people are buying Hennessy with EBT and how we have to cut this. And it's like, dude, what are you saying right now? The entire reason why you are kept alive is because of the federal government, okay? Also, I think people should be able to buy liquor with EBT. They can't, but they should be able to. But that's besides the point. I'm not even having this conversation. It's just that, like, you are personally benefiting from social safety nets, but because there is ostensibly some black person out there that's also benefiting from it, you're like, nah, cut that shit, not recognizing that it'll cut it for you and has been cut for you as well. So stupid.
Throughout my childhood and adult life. In fact, in many states, welfare benefits are actually underutilized due to how difficult it is to get signed up for them and to stay signed up for them. Also, most people who defraud the welfare system are men. But Linda Taylor became the welfare queen, a scapegoat for Republicans to use as they blamed black people for what white supremacy did to them while also decimating public safety net programs. And it's a trope that persists to this day, though usually only in veiled terms and dog whistles. And black women and welfare recipients weren't the only minorities hurt during the Reagan administration. Nancy and Ronnie were also big proponents of Just Say No and the beginning of the war on drugs. Drug users were another convenient scapegoat, and Reagan was responsible for slashing government programs that would have helped people get housed, get clean, or receive the mental health support they needed. And instead he was like, nah, just throw those guys in jail. And more people were also becoming unhoused because of the dramatic tax cuts for the wealthy and decrease in public safety net programs. And being unhoused or doing drugs were seen by Reagan and his supporters not as failures of a system meant to protect and lift up its people, but instead a moral failure of the individual. You're an addict because you decided to do drugs, and that's the only reason. You're unhoused because you're lazy and you won't just apply for a job. This has nothing to do with our policies or the changes we're creating in society. That's a separate issue. This is solely your responsibility and your fault for not lifting yourself up by your bootstraps. And you know who else didn't bootstrap themselves enough? The gays. Oh, you thought the gays weren't part of this? Think again. Ever heard of a little thing called AIDS? Yeah, well, it was rampant in the 80s. It started in the 70s, but no one really knew what it was, and by 1981, at the start of Reagan's presidency, it was becoming an epidemic.
Among the early researchers looking for both a cause and a cure was Dr. Anthony Fauci.
The plan is to put into clinical trials individuals who have full-blown AIDS.
Hundreds and then thousands and then tens of thousands of Americans were dying of it, and Reagan said nothing. The President of the United States said,
he was like, awesome. He literally was like, great. Oh, the sinning homosexuals are just killing themselves? Great. Literally. You actually disagree with the war on drugs? Yes, I do. Just like I disagree with your method of trying to serve a 3-minute ad break at the top of the hour by saying, do you disagree with the war on full-blown war on drugs? Like, come on. Chatter. Ridiculous. The 3-minute ad break is here. The American racial hierarchy is dependent on the worse off white people perceiving themselves above the best black counterparts. So when it all falls apart, white people become reactionary and vote against their own interests because they know it will harm black people, and that's enough for them. Yeah. You know how people do like LGBTQ rights or healthcare, and they do that to like liberals? The real question, ironically enough, is like social safety nets, but black people also get them. And white people have historically, time and time again, throughout history, said, nah, if they're going to get it, I don't want it either. Or rather, don't think about it thoroughly and don't recognize that their social safety nets are going away as well because they advocated for black people to have less. Wonderful stuff. Anyway, what's also wonderful is the safety net of being subscribed at the top of the hour and not seeing a 3-minute ad break. Here it is now.
Absolutely nothing for years, because this was a disease of gay people and drug users, two groups that decidedly were not constituents who voted for Reagan. People who mattered so little to him that a disease that was associated with them and killing thousands of Americans remained on his periphery until it wasn't. Rock Hudson was a major film star in the mid-20th century at the same time Reagan was still pursuing his acting career. Rock Hudson and the Reagans were friends. Rock Hudson was also gay. Rock Hudson was also the first major celebrity to die of AIDS-related complications in 1985. It took the death of a friend for Reagan to even give a shit about this disease that was killing thousands on his watch. And
another such a classic conservative move too. Conservatives only care about an issue when it directly impacts them. Dick Cheney, daughter's a lesbian, super quiet about that sort of thing. Everything else, unimaginably right-wing. It's always until they like personally and directly are harmed by something that causes them to have empathy for it. And usually even then it's like a little bit of empathy. Okay, let's make no mistake. It's not like they turn into like legitimately nice people. Classic conservative trait.
And it would take him 2 more years before he even acknowledged the disease in an official press conference in 1987. By that time, over 30,000 people had contracted the disease and 20,000 people had died in the US alone. But again, even after he finally acknowledged the AIDS epidemic for what it was, he was reluctant to acknowledge it again. Funding for AIDS research under Reagan was slow to come, and it's unclear how the trajectory of the AIDS epidemic would have been different if Reagan had acknowledged it for what it was, a deadly and unknown disease that was killing thousands of Americans regardless of sexuality or drug use. Instead, it remained on the fringes of his presidency for years because, again, in the tidy imagination of his ideal American vision, you are the product of your own actions. You have only yourself to blame. You did gay sex. You injected drugs. Just bootstrap yourself out of AIDS. In this way, Reagan was able to disconnect his policies from the outcomes of his policies. It's the moral failure of individuals, not anything he's done. It's one of the reasons that he's known as the Teflon president. Despite his many failures, and despite the many ways in which he was an incredibly imperfect president, he managed to avoid the reputational damage that most presidents experience and come out the other side as this mythical hero that Republicans still revere to this day. And nothing made more clear Reagan's lasting negative impact on our democracy like the presidency of Donald Trump. In both Donald Trump and Ronald Reagan, we had presidents who were also master showmen. And Reagan really introduced what Trump has seemed to perfect, manipulating the media to his advantage and using dog whistles to ignite his base of supporters. Nancy and Ronald Reagan were both actors before entering the White House. And Ronnie's abilities in front of the camera, his abilities to deliver a line, and his ability to provide a convincing song and dance routine came in handy time and again throughout his presidency. In the Reagans, the media finally had this showy, easily televised president they'd always dreamed of. The Reagans were always ready for a photo op because they understood the power of pictures. They understood that pictures often conveyed a stronger message than what was being said or going on behind the scenes. Sure, we're slashing your benefits, kowtowing to big business, and rubbing elbows with rich people during the worst recession since the Great Depression, but we're also just like you. We're sunshiny and pleasant. We live on a ranch. We're just a couple of cowboys. Reagan was able to use his acting experience to follow the scripts that were given to him, to position himself as folksy and all-American, and to build himself and his vision of America into this myth that still persists today. All the while, Reagan was able to use...
This is important to recognize. She didn't actually bring this part up, but this happened at a time when the Republican Party broadly were like the elitist party in the same way that the Democratic Party is known for being the elitist party now. Where like, this is the era of country club Republicans, Republicans that are like of a higher class, right? A lot of you came to your adolescence in a time when that has gone away in the post-Reagan world. Like many of you probably first started paying attention with the folksy people like George W. Bush. Ironic because he himself is cut from that old country club Republican family. George H.W. Bush is probably one of the greater examples, one of the more recent examples of country club Republicans, probably the last example of a country club Republican, as a matter of fact. Bush Sr., I'm saying, is a country club Republican. Bush Jr. is a great example of like the folksy Republican. And that's the thing. Like Republicans all used to be like Mitt Romney back in the day. But even like down to the Stephen Kings in the Republican Party, they all were unimaginably elitist, like the William F. Buckleys of the world. They presented themselves as like ideological committed fascists. They were elites. They did not lie about being elites. They straight up were like, no, I am an elite and I will rule this country. And they didn't play around with this like this folksy hokey bullshit. Wearing cowboy boots and a hat. They didn't do any of that. They were like, no, I'm a suit and tie ass mother, not a salt of the earth. Know your place. I'm an elite. Reagan, on the other hand, kind of flipped that narrative entirely on its head and was super folksy. And people loved that shit. They were like, oh my God. Because Americans are really stupid. They love marketing. They are probably the most susceptible to marketing ass country on the planet. And that's precisely what Ronald Reagan did. He marketed himself as a real guy, just like you. A folksy hometown hero. So that is why it's very interesting and very important to acknowledge Reagan's aesthetics. Like, because if you look at it now, you're like, what do you mean? That's not that different than like Ted Cruz does that shit. Ted Cruz, Yale graduate Ted Cruz, wears the cowboy boots and shit and walks around like he's a real American working class individual. That's how normalized it is now. But back then, that shit was very unique.
The media during his campaign for presidency and when he reached the White House to drop dog whistles for his supporters who were almost entirely white. And he was really the first person to perfect the dog whistle and use it to his political advantage. For example, he believed in the ultimate right of the individual to own property and to do what he wanted with that property, including excluding whoever he wants from that property. Wink. He believes in states' rights. Wink. And he warned his supporters of the increased dangers in our cities, of welfare queens, and of a need for increased law and order to quell the, and I quote, jungle paths taking root throughout the country. Yikes. He was sunshiny and folksy, but in the end, Reagan was able to capitalize on what Trump later perfected. Fear. Fear of economic instability and fear of racial unrest.
I mean, Joe Biden also used the term racial jungle when talking about desegregation. He was against it. But something to remember, liberals also like hyper focus on the aesthetics, and as long as you're like civil, it doesn't track with them. Like if your policies are like unimaginably racist, liberals oftentimes do not have the capacity to recognize like, oh, this person is like incredibly racist. Just like Jim Crow was not promoted as fuck black people, but instead was promoted as separate but equal. Okay? Conservatives, reactionaries historically always understand how to soften the most damaging, the most historically cruel policies. So that's something that you need to remember. And it's ironic because Ronald Reagan quite literally recently resurfaced audio in private phone correspondences between him and Richard Nixon, called African diplomats monkeys who don't know how to wear shoes. Okay? Like, that's the level of racism that he had. Of course, his policies reflected that reality, but liberals have to hear that for them to understand. Remember that whenever some dumb parent of yours turns around and says, like, what do you mean Ronald Reagan was racist?
All the while fanning the flame of both issues and actively working against the best interest of the base that he is actively fear-mongering. And the final way that Reagan managed to undermine our democracy using a tactic that Trump later perfected was by aligning himself and the Republican Party with white evangelical Christians. The Christian right presented themselves as an opportunity for Reagan. They aligned on many of the same social issues like abortion and tax cuts, and especially the idea of the individual's responsibility for their own fate, that bootstrapping ideology that Reagan clung to. If you need welfare, it's because you're lazy, and you should just get a job. If you don't want to go to hell, you're a sinner, and it's up to you to get into heaven. Any moral failure, and it's straight to the bowels of hell for you. Not only that, but it turns out the evangelicals have a lot of money. One group...
Dude, by the way, this is also the Paul Weyrich moral majority era. Right, this is when white evangelicals, like post civil rights movement, white evangelicals were like this voting bloc that was incredibly white supremacist. Oh my Lord. Unimaginably white supremacist. They were also very active. Paul Weyrich, who is, I think, Catholic himself, recognized that and was like, oh, we need to captivate these guys. We need to bring these guys into the fray. We need to put them under the banner of the Republican Party. We will never lose an election ever again. And that's precisely what happened. The radicalization of the like average Republican, like the Republican Party of the modern age that you know, comes from that background. Yeah, the classic goo government syndrome guy. Yes, Paul Weyrich, who famously said, we don't want more people to vote, dumbass. We want less people to vote. Some of you guys are stupid as dude, they were so racist. They were still wishy-washy on Jews up until the 2000s. I mean, yeah, that's completely gone now. I think now, like, everybody says America was built on Judeo-Christian values. But yeah, that was not a thing at all. Like, the Judeo part was added on later. People used to just simply say America's built on Christian values.
Group of the religious right that had particular sway was called the moral majority. It fought against abortion, the Equal Rights Amendment, and in favor of the family and traditional family values. It was founded in the 70s as a response to counterculture and the gay rights and women's rights movements of the previous decades, and it had a powerful lobbying arm. The moral majority is credited with helping Reagan win the 1980 presidential election. It was through the moral majority and Christian...
By the way, pre-watch, I mean, come on, dude. This is my job. And I know this very well. Its major point of contention was almost always fought on school choice. Like, it literally was first deployed against desegregation in schools because white evangelical Christians did not want to have their kids go to school with black kids. Okay? They used religious freedoms as a way to try and hammer in that point. So much of American politics is still aesthetically played on the boundaries of black people and white people not being around one another. You have to remember that. It sounds reductive. It sounds like some rad lib, but it literally is, okay? So much of American politics is done on the boundaries of white supremacy. So much of it, still to this day.
Fundamentalists, that Reagan was able to find a strong and fervent base of supporters. So it was, of course, in his best interest to make religion take a center stage in his politics. At the 1984 Republican convention, Reagan addressed a group of Christians saying, the truth is, politics and morality are inseparable, and as morality's foundation is religion, religion and politics are necessarily related. He concluded, if we ever forget that we're one nation under God, then we will be a nation.
This is why he didn't give a about abortion, and then after this he was like, I want to make it illegal. Didn't give a shit about abortion early on, originally.
Nation gone under. So much for separation of church and state, am I right? And it was a tactic that worked. It brought more blue-collar and working-class people behind him, and it increased his appeal in the South, a place where his 1980 presidential rival Jimmy Carter typically held favor as the hometown hero. And this allegiance that Reagan struck with the white Christians has stuck to this day. And it was this same base that...
To be fair, I think another aspect of this also was like in the Nixon era too, framing anti-war hippies against the hard hat wearing like real working class Americans who want to go to war all the time. Like that was a big point as well in the elitist Republican Party trying to captivate a higher percentage of the working class vote. Charter school movement was started as a segregation academies in Virginia because the state closed all public schools after Brown v. Board as a way of preventing desegregation from happening. There's a good book called Democracy and Change by Nancy McLean if people want to learn more about the racist roots of anti-public schooling in the U.S. Yeah. Every single issue that you can point to in American politics right now still somehow is historically and in contemporary society fought on the boundaries of separating black people from white people. Straight up.
That Trump was able to tap into to win despite the fact that he's not religious, despite the fact that he actively worked against the best interests of the blue collar and working class people who voted for him, largely because of the ideals he espoused and dog whistles he used to appeal to that base. And it's that link between the Republican Party and evangelicals that has led to the rise of Christian nationalists, to the increase in hateful legislation aimed at trans kids and drag queens, to the dismantling of Roe v. Wade, to the banning of critical race theory and books that present any ideas contrary to the conservative, Christian, nationalist worldview. Over and over again, Reagan did what he had to do to cement power for himself and his rich and powerful supporters. Whether it was cutting taxes, busting unions, or leaning into racist stereotypes and dog whistles, he did whatever he had to do to get what he wanted. His incredibly short-sighted policies and actions while in the White House led to increased economic and social division in America, to a growing distrust between Democrats and Republicans, and to the growth of a strong but small faction of radical conservatives who are using fear-mongering and capitalizing on what divides us in order to further erode our democracy. No, you
New Biden big boy moment dropped. Oh, hell yeah.
They're about to open their convention in Milwaukee, where Donald Trump is expected to.
Zionists own slaves. Every country is on white supremacy. I'm on 1%. Jewish Zionists. What are you saying? Dude, are you okay? Is your brain all right? Like, dude, we're talking about straight up Christian, psychopathic, rabid evangelicals. There is like literally not one mention of Judaism, Jewish people. As a matter of fact, I straight up brought up the idea that like America is a Judeo-Christian nation is like a relatively new phenomena in terms of propaganda in the United States of America. And this motherfucker is like, no, Jews, slavery, Jews did the slavery. It's the Jews. Holy dude. His brain is just so broken. There was a point in time when a guy that was desperately trying to do that was straight up die-in-the-wool Nazi, right? Nowadays, more and more people are becoming like that. Even if they do not have an ideological commitment to fascism, they literally have had their brains broken. I don't think people understand how scary that shit is. How dire of a prospect that is for our future, okay? I'm telling you right now. I'm telling you, dude. Listen, the Jews in this community already know this, already know what I'm talking about. Everyone in this community knows already what I'm talking about. But like, I don't think people understand how much of a nightmare this presents in terms of like future political discourse when everyone is just looking at the actions of Israel and going, yeah, no, it's the Jews and this is for Judaism and I will never trust Jewish people ever again. And just hearing what so many people have said for so many years about how like Israel's actions are directly a consequence of Israel's Zionism, and its actions are directly a consequence of Judaism. Israel is straight up doing like Islamophobic propaganda that the American media demonstrated in an effort to justify the war on terror, but Israel is voluntarily doing that anti-Semitic propaganda. I've never seen anything like it. It's like being ISIS. But instead, Jake Tapper literally has like the head of ISIS on CNN. And the head of ISIS is like, yeah, we're doing this for Islam. And all of the supporters of ISIS are just like prominently displaying their allegiance as Muslims. You know what I mean? They're like, yeah, no, this is how Islam is supposed to work. ISIS is doing a great job. Biden read a note from his staff out loud during a call. Oh, my Lord. During Joe Biden's call with the Congressional Progressive Caucus, the president said his staff passed him a note to stay positive. You're sounding defensive. Biden read the note aloud to the participants of the call. A lawmaker on the call says president was making fun of his staff who passed him the note. In context, wasn't acknowledging the note, but then being the way he wanted to be on the call, not like he didn't know what he was doing. I don't believe that. Sure. Yeah, no, definitely. Just like when he said President Putin to President Zelensky, he was just making a joke.
You can't pin everything that's happening in America today onto one man, but I double dog dare you to find a person or a president who is more culpable for the current social, political, and economic instability than President Ronald Reagan. And I haven't even touched on his stance on communism. Stay tuned for next week when I answer the question, why are Americans so obsessed with communism? For now, check out my latest video all about why America is still segregated. Thanks so much for watching. Have a good day. Bye-bye.
She's great. Anyway.